He rescued a giant Zulu woman from the river. Next day, her father came with an unexpected reward. The river clawed through the valley like a cold beast, its skin broken with white foam where the current tore against submerged stones. Dawn had not yet gathered itself, only a dull grey light slanting between the black trunks of pine and spruce. The air was iron. Frost had settled even on the bark, and when John Mercer exhaled, his breath hung in front of him like a faint ghost refusing to disperse. He trudged down the embankment, with the steady caution of a man used to ice giving underfoot. The world was still, except for the groan of the river and the occasional report of timber cracking in the distance, trees freezing and splitting at their cores. He had come to cut ice blocks, as he did every morning. The camp needed them for the storage shed. Salted meat spoiled too fast otherwise. His axe hung from his belt, and a short-handled hook rested against his shoulder. He wore wool under his flannel, thick mittens, and his old fur cap matted from years of sweat. The air bit his face raw, but he felt alive in it. After 16 years in the northern woods, he had learned to take the cold like an old scar, part of him, not something to fight. He reached the river's edge, knelt, and touched the ice with his glove. The surface was brittle near the rocks, but thick where the current slowed. He leaned forward to test a slab, and that was when he saw her. At first, he thought it was driftwood, dark, massive, caught against a bend where the current bent toward the far bank. Then the shape rolled, and an arm broke through the surface. The skin gleamed against the slate water, bronze and strong. Fingers curled as if reaching for the air. His body moved before thought caught up. The hook clattered onto the snow, and he was running, boots slamming against ice, breath ragged. He shouted, but his voice vanished under the roar of the water. The river was near breaking season. The edges held, but the center flowed fast and cruel. He reached the bend and saw her again, half submerged, caught by her dress tangled on a root. Her head lifted for a moment, eyes wide and desperate, and the sight froze him for half a second. She was enormous, taller, broader than any woman he had ever seen, with shoulders like carved oak and hair streaming in dark ropes. Then she slipped under again. John plunged forward, the ice cracking under his weight. The water took his legs, numbing him to the bone in an instant. He reached out, caught the edge of the root where she had snagged, and pulled himself closer. The current tore at them both. His hands found fabric, heavy, soaked linen. He gripped it, felt the weight of her body pulling against him. "Hold still," he gasped, though he doubted she could hear him. His muscles screamed. Inch by inch he dragged her free, the river fighting to claim her again. When they broke the surface together, she coughed hard, a sound like a bear waking. He turned her onto her side, water streaming from her mouth and hair, then hauled her by the arms toward the shallows. By the time they reached the shore, his hands no longer obeyed him. He collapsed beside her, chest heaving. The woman lay motionless except for the faint rise of her breath. Her skin was dark as oiled walnut, her features broad and proud even in exhaustion. He had never seen anyone like her this far north. A heavy necklace of carved bone hung at her throat, strange against the snow. John pulled his coat off and threw it over her. His fingers, stiff and white, struggled to unlace his boots, to rub warmth into his feet. She stirred then, eyes fluttering open. When she spoke, her voice was low, husky, and accented, words broken but clear enough. "You pulled me out," she said. He nodded, still catching breath. "River nearly took you." Her gaze lingered on him, unreadable. Then she looked toward the forest behind him, as if measuring where she was. "I walked 2 days," she murmured. "Then the ice broke." John wanted to ask where she had come from, but she began shivering violently. He rose, went to the sled he had left near the path, and dragged it back. He lifted her, astonished by the weight and size of her frame, and settled her onto the furs. Her body heat seeped into him even through the cold air. They made the slow climb toward the ridge, where his cabin sat a half-mile from the river. The trees closed around them, whispering with the soft hiss of snow. His arms ached from pulling, but he didn't stop. He kept glancing back, partly to check if she still breathed, partly because there was something about her that unsettled him. Not fear exactly, more like awe. When the cabin came into view, a squat shape half buried in snow, he almost laughed from relief. Smoke still curled from the chimney. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, dragged the sled in far enough to lift her onto the bed, and shut out the wind. The smell of pine resin and smoke filled the room. He lit the lantern, fed the stove, and peeled off his wet clothes. She stirred again, eyes following him with the faint awareness of someone between sleep and waking. He poured hot water from the kettle, found his last dry blanket, and covered her. For a long while, he just sat near the fire, watching the steam rise from her damp hair. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier. "You live alone," he nodded. "No one else foolish enough to stay through winter." She studied him. "You cut the trees?" "Yes. Timber camp's a mile north. They send me tools, sometimes food." She seemed to understand. Her gaze dropped to the fire. "My name is Nandi." He repeated it quietly, testing the sound. "John Mercer." The wind howled outside, pressing snow against the windows. For the next hour, they said nothing more, only the sound of the fire, the slow thawing of her breath. When sleep came, it took them both. Morning brought a pale sun and silence. John woke first. The woman was still asleep, her arm draped across the blanket like a fallen branch. He stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall, but the air was clean, sharp. He went to the shed to check the traps. 3 rabbits, stiff with frost. He skinned them quickly, thinking about her. When he returned, she was sitting up. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders, and he saw the breadth of her back, muscles moving under her skin like ropes beneath hide. She looked around the small cabin. Tools hung neatly, the stove humming, the smell of stew beginning. "You were kind," she said softly. John shrugged. "You'd have done the same." Her eyes lifted to his, and for a moment he felt the weight of that look, like being seen down to the marrow. "I was walking to find my father," she said. "He was taken by white men years ago. They said he came north." John froze, ladle hovering over the pot. He had heard stories, groups brought from far coasts, forced through the settlements, some ending up as labourers for the companies. "You think he's here?" he asked quietly. "I followed words," she said. "Traders spoke of a man, tall, black like me. They called him Mbeki, said he worked with the woodcutters." John set the ladle down slowly. He had heard that name once, in the camp, an older man who worked the saws the first winter John arrived. Big as a bear, quiet, respected. He had left 2 seasons ago, back toward the southern tracks. He met her eyes. "I knew of him, not where he is now." She absorbed the words without reaction, then looked into the fire. "He will find me, if I live." The simplicity of it cut through him. No pleading, no fear, just certainty. They ate in silence. When she reached for the bowl, her hands dwarfed it. He noticed the scars on her knuckles, long healed. After breakfast, John went to the woodpile. She followed him outside, wrapped in his coat. The sun had gained strength, melting the frost on the roof edge. She watched him split logs, her breath misting. "You fight the trees," she said with a faint smile. "They fight back," he answered. He expected her to laugh, but instead she picked up the axe from the stump, tested its weight, and with one motion split a log clean in 2. The sound cracked through the still air. She set the axe down calmly, as if nothing remarkable had happened. John stared, half impressed, half uncertain. "You'll do fine in the north," he said. "I have done worse," she replied. That night, the wind rose again. Snow battered the windows like fists. Inside, the fire glowed low and orange. John sat sharpening his saw, while she mended the edge of her torn dress. He could hear the rhythm of her breathing, steady and deep. "You will go when the thaw comes?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "If the river lets me. My father will know this place." He hesitated. "The river nearly took you." She looked at him with calm defiance. "It did not." Something in the way she said it made him feel small, and yet strangely at peace. They spoke little after that. When he lay in his bunk, listening to the wind, he found himself replaying the moment he had seen her hand break the surface. How strong it had looked. Snow still fell in thin needles when the dawn broke over the timber camp. The light turned the world the colour of pewter. Even smoke from the chimneys looked frozen. John Mercer woke before the others. He stepped outside, pulled air into his chest, and felt the ache of yesterday's rescue still burning in his arms. Inside the bunkhouse, Nandi stirred. She rose from the cot that creaked under her weight and wrapped herself in the blanket he had given her. No word passed between them until the first shouts from the sawpit carried through the cold. John walked her toward the cookhouse. Men stopped working long enough to stare. Their faces were raw with wind, beards full of ice, eyes narrowed against the sight of someone who did not belong. The cook, A thin Irishman named Finn froze when she ducked through the doorway. "Lord above," he muttered. John said nothing. He sat her at the far table, poured coffee, and broke bread into the stew bowl. Nandi ate in silence, spoon steady, eyes never leaving the window. By noon the camp hummed again. The saws rasped, sleds groaned under new loads, and the forest echoed with the deep rhythm of work. John joined his team on the ridge. Each stroke of the two-man saw was an argument against the cold. When he paused to wipe sweat that froze on his brow, he caught sight of her again, near the horses, helping mend harness straps. The teamsters watched her arms, the easy strength in them. A few smirked, others whispered. The sound carried. That evening the foreman, Calder, called John into the shack. "Your friend's stirring up talk," he said, leaning over the ledger. "Men don't take kindly to strangers in camp, least of all one built like a legend." "She's leaving soon," John said. "She better. Last thing we need is trouble before the spring haul." John's jaw tightened. "She's done nothing." Calder looked up. "She's a sight none of us have seen before." "That's enough." John left without answering. Outside, the night had fallen heavy. Nandi waited by the sleds, eyes on the northern sky. "They do not want me here," she said. He nodded. "Tomorrow we go east," she added. "If my father worked those lines, I will find him there." John felt the pull in his chest again, the need to go, the fear to stay. "Then I'll go with you," he said. She did not thank him. She only looked into his eyes a long moment and said, "Bring food." They left before sunrise. Frost dusted their clothes until they looked carved from stone. The trees crowded close, muffling every sound except the creak of snowshoes. Once a fox crossed the trail ahead, tail brushing the white air like smoke. Around noon they reached the ridge. From there the world stretched endless. Rivers locked in ice, hills stripped bare by wind. She studied it as though reading a map written in memory. He would go toward the rail, she said. Men always follow the noise of iron. They descended through birch thickets, their branches thin as ribs. John kept pace behind her, watching the steadiness of her stride. She never stumbled, never slowed, though the wind rose until the world was nothing but drifting light and shadow. When they stopped for rest, he built a fire with trembling hands. She crouched beside it, silent, face lit gold. "You think too much," she said suddenly. "The fire or the man?" he asked. "Both." That night they camped under a rock shelf, snow packed against the windside. John chewed dried meat while she stared into the dark. "When you pulled me from the river," she said, "I thought maybe the water wanted me more than the land." "You would have drowned," he said. "Maybe that was easier, but the cold taught me again to breathe." He looked at her profile against the flame, the strong line of her jaw. "You've got fight enough for 10 lives. She smiled faintly. "It is not fight, it is remembering." Morning came with blue light. Their breath hung like smoke. They moved east again, following the frozen stream until the ground climbed. The silence of the forest pressed on them, broken only by the crack of ice underfoot. Near midday they found sled tracks deep and frozen. Nandi crouched, tracing them with her fingers. "These are heavy," she said. "Too heavy for one man." "Company haulers, maybe," John guessed. She nodded, eyes narrowing. "Or my father's." They followed until dusk. The tracks led to a hollow where the trees parted around a frozen pond. There, half-collapsed tents stood in the snow. John called out once, no answer. They approached carefully. The first tent was empty, except for a rusted lantern. The second held a body curled under a torn blanket. Nandi stopped. Her breath left her in one sound, short and raw. She knelt, brushed the snow from the man's face. The skin was dark like hers, beard rimed with ice, eyes closed as though sleeping. "Baba," she whispered. John stepped back, giving her space. The wind shifted, scattering powder over the still form. She laid her hand on the man's chest, fingers trembling. "He came far," she said softly. "Farther than they thought he could." John bowed his head. "He died free." She nodded once. "That is a good death." They built a cairn from stones pulled out of the frozen ground. Each rock thudded into place with slow finality. When the mound was high as her knee, she pressed her palm against the top and murmured something in her tongue, a sound low and even, like the river under ice. John did not ask what it meant. When the fire burned that night, the light touched her face in soft orange. "In my land," she said, "when a man saves a life, he must be repaid in kind. I have nothing but this." She reached into the small pouch at her belt and drew a carved pendant, bone polished smooth by years of touch. "My father's," he shook his head. "Keep it." "No." You will wear it so he knows who gave me back my road." She placed it in his palm. The bone was warm from her skin. He closed his fist slowly around it. The next morning, she said she would travel south when the thaw came, back toward the Iron Road. "There are others of my people there. Maybe they will remember my father's name." John stared at the snow. "You could stay. The camp could use hands like yours." She smiled without humor. "Men there will not work beside me. You'd prove them wrong." She shook her head. "I have proved enough," he understood. The silence after that was heavy but clean. They began the trek back toward the valley, their footprints filling with wind behind them. At the ridge she stopped and looked back at the cairn far below, a small dark mound in the white expanse. "He will sleep warm," she said. "You gave him that." John wanted to speak, but couldn't find words that didn't sound small. She turned, rested a hand on his shoulder. "When you look at the river, remember that some of us were carried farther than the water ever meant." Then she walked ahead, long strides cutting through the drifts until the trees swallowed her shape. John watched the space where she had vanished until his eyes watered from the brightness of the snow. The forest swallowed everything quickly in this country. Sound, scent, even the shape of a person. He stood a long while, the wind drawing thin lines of frost across his beard, before he turned back toward his cabin. Every step felt heavier, as though the land itself resisted his leaving. He reached the river by dusk. The ice groaned under his boots, shifting with a dull moan that rose and fell like a living thing. The sky had turned the color of steel. A few flakes drifted down, lazy, almost playful. He walked slower near the bend where he had first seen her arm break the surface. The place seemed smaller now, emptied of its miracle. A single raven perched on a branch above the water, its head cocked, black eyes sharp as flint. John tossed a pebble into the current and watched the ripples swallow it whole. At the cabin, he built a fire and hung his coat to dry. The room smelled of resin and ash. He sat at the table, the pendant she had given him resting in his palm. The bone was etched with lines too faint to read, but deep enough that his thumb could feel them. Circles within circles, maybe water, maybe sun. He slipped it around his neck, felt its weight settle against his chest, and for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel empty. Days passed. The camp sent runners with messages. The thaw would come early. The hauls had begun downriver. John worked alone, clearing brush, mending his sled. Each night he wrote small marks on the doorframe, measurements of days, though he didn't know why he kept them. Perhaps to see how long until the memory faded, though it never did. Then one afternoon, he saw movement on the far bank. At first, he thought it a moose cutting through the trees, but the gait was wrong, deliberate, upright. The figure crossed slowly, steady even as the ice cracked around its boots. When the shape came clear, John's breath caught. It was not Nandi. It was an older man, tall but bent by age, skin the color of deep bronze, a fur cloak across his shoulders. The man carried a long walking stick carved with symbols that glinted when the light struck. John stepped outside, hand instinctively on the axe at his belt. The man raised a palm in greeting. His voice carried across the ice, low and sure. "You are John Mercer?" John nodded. "That's me. I am called Mbeki." The words hit like a hammer. John felt the world tilt slightly beneath him. "Your daughter," he began. "She found me," the man said. "Then she went south. She said you brought her from the water when she had no strength." John's throat tightened. "I thought you were dead." Mbeki smiled faintly. "Death walks slower than men think. I was east when the fever took my crew. I buried them, then followed her tracks back through the hills." John motioned toward the cabin. "You'd better come in before the cold finishes the job." Inside, Mbeki sat near the stove, hands open to the heat. His face was lined like old bark, but the eyes burned clear. "She said you live with no family," he said. "None left." "She also said you do not speak much." John half smiled. "She speaks enough for two." Mbeki's laughter was soft but full. "That she does." Then his expression changed, more solemn. "She told me of the river, of the snow, of the way you fought the water to reach her. Where I come from, a man who pulls another from death becomes part of that family. I cannot leave you with only words." He reached into his pack and drew out a small parcel wrapped in leather. Inside lay a blade, short, curved, the metal darkened by age. The handle was bound in sinew, the sheath carved with the same circles as the pendant. He placed it on the table. "This was mine before I was taken. It was my father's before me. I give it to you." John stared at the weapon. I can't take that. You already have, Mbeki said. The river took one debt from our blood. Let me pay another. John hesitated, then picked up the blade. It felt alive in his hand, perfectly balanced. Thank you, he said quietly. Mbeki nodded. Use it only when your heart speaks first. They ate together that night, salted meat, bread hardened by the cold. Conversation came slow but steady. Mbeki told him of the years since he left the camp, how he had worked the rail lines, hunted alone, how he had felt his daughter's presence in dreams. I walked north because the wind carried her scent, he said simply. John didn't question it. Some truths needed no proof. When they finished, the old man leaned back. She said you will not go south. Is that true? John nodded. The world down there has too many voices. I hear enough here. Mbeki smiled. Then this land has claimed you. He stood, stretching slowly, and stepped outside. John followed. The sky burned faintly green where the lights began to move. Curtains of colour shifting like breath across the stars. Mbeki looked up, eyes shining. In my home, we said the spirits walked in the sky when they had work left undone. Here they walk colder, but the meaning is the same. John didn't correct him. The moment was too quiet to break. They stood together until the cold bit their faces raw. When they returned to the fire, Mbeki said he would leave at dawn. There are others like me near the southern rail. I will tell them the north still remembers our blood. John clasped his hand. The grip was strong, sure. If you find her, tell her she can come back. Any time. I will tell her, the old man said. But she already knows. Understood. Here's the next part of the story. Spring came late to the frontier that year, dragging its heels through mud and meltwater. The ice left the river in pieces, breaking with long cracks that echoed through the valley like distant thunder. The men in camp worked from dawn until the last trace of light, pushing logs down the slides, shouting over the roar of current. John Mercer worked among them, silent, steady, the same as ever, though something in his eyes had changed. He no longer looked for the end of the day. He simply endured it. When the final raft was bound and sent downstream, the foreman let the crews break. Some headed south with pay in their pockets, chasing liquor and women in the towns along the track. John stayed. He repaired tools, mended roofs, hunted. The quiet suited him. Nights were longer now, soft with the smell of wet pine. He found himself sitting by the river more often, listening to its new voice. The current no longer growled, it whispered. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the ridges, he saw a shape across the water, a rider. The horse moved slow, deliberate, its hooves sinking into mud. When the figure reached the ford, John rose, squinting through the low light. It was a woman wrapped in a dark cloak. His heart stuttered once, but he forced himself still. The horse climbed the bank, breath steaming. When she pulled back the hood, he knew. Nandi. She looked thinner, travel-worn, but her eyes were the same, steady, full of that quiet certainty that unsettled him. He took a step forward. She smiled faintly. You thought the river would keep me, she said. He shook his head. No, just didn't expect to see you again. I went south, as I said. My father told me to return before the snows. He said the north still owed me something. John nodded slowly. He passed through here. I know. He found the coast and rest. He wanted me to bring you thanks. She dismounted, tying the reins to a low branch. He said you carry his knife. John touched the hilt at his belt. I do. Then you carry his word. They walked to the cabin together. Inside, she looked around with a faint smile. It has not changed. Neither has much else. You still work alone? He shrugged. The trees don't argue. She laughed, a low sound that filled the room. You haven't forgotten how to speak, then. He poured coffee for both of them. Her hands dwarfed the cup. She looked into the dark liquid before taking a sip. I brought something, she said. From her pack, she drew a small folded cloth. Inside lay seeds, smooth, black, shaped like teardrops. These grow fast. We use them to feed the cattle back home. They will grow here if the sun allows. John turned one in his fingers. Nothing grows easy here. Nothing worth growing does, she said. They planted them the next day behind the cabin, in a patch of soil still hard from frost. She worked bare-handed, turning the earth with her fingers. John fetched water from the river, poured it gently over the dark mounds. When they finished, she stood, wiping her hands on her dress. Now we wait, she said. Like everything else, weeks passed. The forest shifted from brown to green, then to the deep, almost black shade of full summer. The seeds sprouted, thin stalks at first, then leaves wide as his palms. Nandi smiled each morning when she saw them. She built a small fence of sticks to keep the rabbits out. John helped, though he didn't say much. He had grown used to her presence again. The sound of her humming while she worked. The way her laughter softened the corners of the cabin. At night they sat by the fire, sharing stories in pieces. She spoke of the coast, of ships and markets, of languages mixed like smoke. He told her of the winters before she came, the years of solitude that now felt like someone else's life. Sometimes she fell silent, eyes on the flames. "You think too much," she would say without looking at him. He would smile because she was right. By midsummer, the plants reached his waist. Their leaves shimmered with dew each morning. Nandi touched them as if greeting old friends. "They will live through the frost," she said. "They remember where they come from." One evening, thunder rolled from the west. The wind smelled of iron. John secured the shutters while she gathered tools. The storm broke with sudden violence, rain hammering the roof, lightning cutting the sky in white sheets. The river rose fast, pounding against its banks. John stepped outside to check the fence. The water was already spilling over. "It'll take them," he shouted. Nandi ran to his side. "Then we save what we can." They worked in the downpour, pulling the larger plants by hand, carrying them to higher ground. The river swallowed the rest, roots torn, leaves spinning away like lost pages. When it was over, they stood soaked to the bone, mud up to their knees. The field was a ruin. She looked at it without speaking, then turned to him. Hair plastered to her face. "The land tests what it keeps," she said quietly. He nodded. "Sometimes it keeps nothing," she smiled sadly. "Then we plant again." That night they dried their clothes by the fire. The rain still whispered on the roof. He watched her hands move over the damp fabric, strong and certain. "You could go back south," he said. "You'd have easier soil." She looked up. "And leave this?" Her eyes moved around the small room, the tools, the walls blackened with smoke. "No. My father said the north owed me something. I think it is you." He stared at her, not trusting his voice. She reached out, touched the pendant that hung against his chest. "He gave you this to remind you of courage," she said. "Not to hang it like a weight." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. For a long time neither spoke. Then she drew her hand back and said softly, "Sleep. Tomorrow we begin again." In the morning, mist lay over the valley. They walked to the ruined patch and began turning the soil once more. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. She worked faster than he did, humming again. When he asked what the song meant, she said, "It is for beginning. We sing it when the old life ends." By the time the sun reached the treetops, the new seeds were in. They stood side by side, looking down at the rows. "They'll take," she said. "They'll have to," he replied. Late that night, when the world was still, she rose from her cot and stood by the window. John woke and watched her silhouette against the pale glow outside. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "The river talks too much." He listened. The water was louder than usual, swollen from the storm, grinding against stones. "It's just finding its path again." "So are we," she said, and turned back toward him. Her eyes caught the faint light, dark, calm, unflinching. "In my land, when someone saves your life, you must live near them until both debts are paid." "I think my father knew that." John felt his throat tighten. Maybe he did. She crossed the room, knelt by the fire, added a log. "Then I will stay until I learn what the debt means." Outside, the wind eased. The new plants rustled softly under the stars. Inside, the flame climbed higher, throwing gold across the walls, and the two of them sat in silence, listening to the slow breathing of the north. The weeks that followed passed in a rhythm neither had to name. Work at dawn, soil under their nails, sweat on their backs, the hiss of the kettle in the evenings. The quiet companionship of two people who had learned the same truth, that the world was not merciful, but it could be endured. The plants grew again, stronger than before. By midsummer they reached his chest, their stalks dark and thick. Nandi said they would feed through winter if they dried them right. John built a rack near the chimney, stringing each stem with care. The smell filled the cabin, sweet and sharp. Sometimes travellers passed along the ridge, loggers heading south, a trapper with a sled of pelts, but they always kept their distance when they saw the tall woman working the field. Rumours spread fast in the frontier. Some called her a ghost, others a legend. John didn't correct them. The silence protected them both. One morning, Nandi returned from the river with a fish as long as her arm. She laid it on the table, smiling. "The river feeds us now," she said. John nodded. "Maybe it remembers what it owes." She gave a short laugh. Then it must owe much. They smoked the fish over a low fire, the scent curling through the clearing. That night they ate in silence, the only sound the crack of bones as she split them for the marrow. "You eat like a man who's been hungry too long," she said. "I have been," he answered simply. Summer slid into autumn. The nights grew sharper, the wind cutting through the trees like a blade. The leaves turned copper, then fell. They gathered them for kindling, stacking piles against the wall. When the first frost came, John found Nandi outside before dawn, standing barefoot in the snow, eyes closed. "You'll lose your feet," he said. She smiled without opening her eyes. "I'm listening." "To what?" "The cold. It has a voice if you wait." He watched her a long moment, then went back inside and poured her coffee. When she joined him, her skin steamed from the heat of her own body. Later that day, while cutting logs, John heard the faint jingle of harnesses on the trail. He looked up. 2 riders approached, a company man in a fur coat and another younger one holding the reins of a pack horse. When they reached the cabin, the older man dismounted. "Mercer?" "That's right. Calder sent us. He's dead. Heart gave out last month. New foreman wants to speak with you. Says you've been too long away from company work." John wiped his hands on his trousers. "I'm done with camps." The man looked past him toward the field where Nandi was stacking wood. His gaze lingered too long. "You living alone out here?" John stepped closer. "No business of yours." The man raised a hand in mock peace. "Suit yourself. But the company's claiming this stretch next spring. You might want to move before the saws come." When they rode off, the silence they left felt heavier than before. Nandi joined him by the door. "They will come?" "Yes. Then we must go." He looked toward the forest. "There's nowhere left to go." She studied his face. "You fear the noise." "I fear losing what little peace I've found." "Peace is not a place," she said. "It is the weight you can carry without breaking." That night, neither slept. He sat by the window, watching the dark line of the trees. She moved quietly around the cabin, gathering their few things. A blanket, the pouch of seeds, the knife, his old axe. Near dawn, she said, "We will not wait for them." He nodded. "No, they left when the first snow began to fall, heading north where the forest thickened and the land turned wild. The trail narrowed to little more than a deer path. They travelled light, taking only what they could carry. At night they built small fires, their shadows stretching long and thin across the snow. The cold deepened, but Nandi walked as if she had been born to it. When John stumbled, she caught his arm with the same sure strength she had shown the day he pulled her from the river. After a week, they reached the high valley, an untouched sweep of pine and frozen streams. John stopped at the crest, breathing hard. "We could build here," he said. She looked around, nodding. "The ground is high. The snow will not drown us." They built slowly, using what the forest gave. Logs cut thick, moss for chinking, bark for the roof. The cabin rose like a scar against the white slope. It was smaller than the old one, tighter, but it held warmth. Each day they worked until their hands cracked. Each night they slept close to the fire, the sound of wind moving over the roof. Winter took hold early. The river froze solid by mid-season. Game grew scarce. John set traps while Nandi cut wood. The days blurred into one long cold breath. Yet there was peace in it, the kind that comes only when a man accepts the world on its own terms. One night, during the hardest stretch of cold, Nandi woke to the sound of footsteps outside. She reached for the knife, motioned John to stay still. Through the frost-covered window, they saw a figure approaching, small, wrapped in rags. When she opened the door, a boy collapsed at her feet, skin blue with cold. His face was too thin, his hands raw. "Help," he whispered. "Camp burned. They're gone." They carried him to the fire, fed him broth until colour returned to his cheeks. Between shivers, he told his story. Raiders, timber thieves, men who stripped the camps and vanished into the woods. Nandi listened, her face unreadable. When he finished, she covered him with a blanket. "You live now," she said. "Rest." Later, John said, "He'll slow us down." She shook her head. "He reminds us who we are." The boy stayed. He fetched water, gathered kindling, listened to their silence as if learning a language. Sometimes he asked about the south, about the river, about the land before the snow. Nandi told him stories, not of spirits, but of people who survived because they refused to die. John watched her as she spoke, her face lit by firelight, and felt again that same quiet awe he had known when she rose from the river. As the days shortened, the boy grew stronger. He learned to set snares, to chop wood cleanly. The cabin filled with the smell of smoke and dried meat. They had built a small family without meaning to. Then one morning, the sound of hooves came again, distant at first, then closer, sharper. John stepped outside, hand on his axe. Through the trees he saw men riding hard, rifles across their saddles, the company's red scarves around their necks. They were coming fast, and they were not looking for conversation. The riders broke through the trees before noon, their shouts tearing the stillness. John pushed the boy inside and handed Nandi the rifle. She took it without a word, checked the chamber, and waited by the window. Snow swirled in sudden gusts. The air smelled of powder and pine. The first man rode close enough for John to see the company mark burned into his coat. "You on company land, Mercer!" he shouted. "Orders say clear it or burn it." John stepped forward, axe in hand. "This is no company land. It's earned," the man sneered. "You and your woman think you can own the north." The shot came before he finished. Nandi fired once, the sound cracking like thunder. The rider fell sideways, horse rearing and bolting into the trees. The rest scattered, firing wild into the snow. John pulled the boy down and crawled to the door. "They'll come back," he said. "Then we end it now," she answered. They fought until the light died, until smoke and snow became one. When the last echo faded, only silence remained. The horses were gone. The ground was red against the white. John stood leaning on his axe, breath ragged. Nandi's shoulder bled where a bullet had grazed her, but she smiled through it. "The land keeps who it wants," she said softly. They buried the dead far from the cabin, marked the graves with stones. No one came after that. Winter deepened, and the forest closed around them again. The boy healed, stronger each day. The crops, half saved from the storm, survived under snow until spring. When the thaw returned, the valley filled with light. The river ran clear, washing away the tracks of that long, hard season. One morning, Nandi stood on the bank where John had once dragged her from the water. She turned to him and said, "This river took much from us. Now it gives back." He looked at her, at the boy chasing along the shore, and felt something inside him unclench for the first time in years. They built a new cabin higher on the ridge, where the sun reached early and the earth stayed dry. The boy planted the seeds she had carried from her home. They grew wild and green through summer, leaves humming in the wind. At night they sat by the fire, the three of them, and the silence between them no longer felt like loss. It felt like belonging. Years later, when traders passed through, they spoke of a small farm hidden in the northern woods, tended by a woman tall as a pine and a man with eyes like river ice. They said the land there never froze as hard as elsewhere, as if some old debt between water and blood had finally been paid. John Mercer never returned to the camps. Nandi never left the valley again. The boy grew, learned the forest, learned the patience of those who live where mercy is rare. Together they endured, season after season, until endurance itself became their story. And when the wind rose from the river, carrying the scent of pine and thawing earth, it carried their laughter with it. Lo, human and whole. If you enjoyed, please subscribe and comment what country you're watching from. See you in the next one.